Hello everyone and welcome back. Today I am ranting. In all honesty, I'm not entirely sure what to title this rant other than here have a problem that I keep encountering when I'm doing my research for our classes. I need to rant about it, and rather than going on a digression during a class, I thought I'd make a separate little video. So the problem that I keep encountering has to do with something that I try to do before I ever present a class to my students, teach a class online, write a paper or a book about something. I try to do this, right? Before I construct my arguments, whether that is in a class, a paper, or a book that I am writing, I try really hard to research the counter arguments. As in, if I have a position that I am holding, I try to read the arguments against the position that I'm holding. I do this for 3 reasons. 1, I might just be wrong. It does happen. It happens a lot. Sometimes I'm just wrong about things. And I need to be willing to acknowledge that I have inherent biases, that I am blind to certain things, that I am in some ways incredibly privileged and just don't notice some aspects of any given argument, and also that I have a stake in the game in some cases. Like there is often something that I'm hoping to prove because it is what I want to be true. And I have to acknowledge that about myself and make sure that I read the counter arguments. Does this sometimes mean that I'm reading the works of people that I dislike and deeply disagree with? Yes, it does, which is why if you ask me for a list of every book I own, there's going to be books on that list that I don't necessarily recommend to others, but that I own and I have read. All right. The second reason that I read arguments that I disagree with has to do with being able to argue against what is actually being said. Rather than assuming I understand the arguments of the people that I'm arguing with, I better read them in their own words and understand exactly what it is that I'm refuting, rather than making assumptions. And third reason I do this brings me to what I want to rant about, which is that sometimes I end up finding the information that supports my argument based on things that they just breezed past and ignored, basically holes in their research, where I go, well, wait a second, it seems like there's a hole there. And I go look at it and I'm like, oh, there's the evidence for my counter argument. Or the things that they sort of mention but dismiss as irrelevant, right? And I go, well, you mentioned that as something that could potentially be a counter-argument, but you kind of blew past it. So I'm going to go read into that. And then I'm like, really? Which brings me to my rant. So I am teaching a class on the history and traditional use of herbal amenagogues, abortifacients, and contraceptives. It is a private class that people have registered for. If you look on our Facebook, you can find out how to register for it. It doesn't matter to me if you register late. All the previous classes have been recorded, as have all of the assignments, so it's something that someone can join at any time. That private class is going to be 3 to 4 months long and happen weekly, and it goes into everything from the history to the traditional recipes that herbalists from the previous centuries have used. It goes into why they used certain plants. It goes into the dangers of those plants. It's a very in-depth course, and right now we're teaching the history portion of it, from the ancient, pre-written history all the way to modern times. What is the history of herbal amenagogues, abortifacients, and contraceptives? Now, one of the things that I was taught growing up was that midwives and people who were healers and people who were herbalists were targeted as witches. They were accused of being witches, whether they were or not. That's not the argument. They were accused of being witches and they were targeted, and in many cases they were executed. I read a paper that said, nope, that's not the case. Midwives were not targeted. They were not accused of being witches. That's a myth. Because I believe in reading the well-reasoned counter-argument and looking at their sources and seeing if, in fact, what I believe is not the case. Because it might be not the case. I might be wrong. Whew, this paper. Oh, this paper. And I thought that maybe I was like the only one incensed by it, but then in one of my source books for the class that I was teaching by Riddle, who is a historian on this topic, also called out the paper for this problem. So I was like, oh, it's not just me. It's not me. Well, not only me. I was ranting about it in the Discord for Sanctum. And then I ended up finding Riddle being like, this is a problem. So this is a problem specifically from this one person's article, but it's a problem I've encountered a lot. So one, these writers ignore evidence that doesn't support their position. They just slide past it, they just breeze past it, they mention it in just little half sentences, or they don't mention it at all and they just skip over it. So for example, this person, Hurley, just kind of blew past papal bulls, entire books that specifically targeted midwives and accused them of being witches. And there's no way that he didn't have access to that information, because he had access to the information all around it, if that made sense. So it's an intentional absence. Additionally, he kept putting things out of order, which is something I've noticed a lot of people do, even authors that I really like, even authors that I'm using as sources, will sort of order things, like they'll be in, you know, the 1320s, and then they'll be all the way forward in the 1600s, and they'll be in the 1500s, in a way that supports their argument and ignores the cultural shifts through those centuries that maybe don't support their argument. They'll basically cherry pick from history facts that support them and ignore shifts in culture through those centuries, ignore that something might have been an uncommon opinion and that there's actually a lot of overwhelming evidence of what was the common opinion, and just making things out of order and thus confusing. So that they can say, see, I have lots of people that I can cite that support my argument. And the other is to just say, nope, even though there's evidence that goes against what I'm saying, nope, I don't believe it. So for example, like at one point Hurley was like, there were no cases in the Inquisition, in the colonial invasion of Mexico, that the Inquisition in Mexico did not target midwives as witches, except for these two examples where it did. But they don't matter. Like, I'm going to tell you that they exist, but they don't matter. Or at one point he said there were no midwives accused of being witches in this particular country at this time, except for these two really famous ones, but they don't count because I've decided that they don't count, except that the two really famous ones that he listed, they do count. And if, there was one that really bothered me, and it may end up being a separate rant on how, no, she was absolutely a midwife, and she was absolutely accused of being a witch, and it's whether or not she was a witch that's debatable, not whether or not she was a midwife. But, or like just refusing to research the terminology of the time period you're writing about. So for example, one of the ways that he would argue that somebody wasn't a midwife was because they were being called a wise wife instead. That's one of the meanings of wise wife. Midwife. Midwife is kind of a new term. Wise wife was a midwife. So he literally, it's actually funny. I'm gonna have to cite his paper repeatedly in my sources for writing this class, because he actually found examples of midwives who'd been accused of being witches that I hadn't found yet in my sources. But he just kept being like, but they don't count, but they don't count, but they don't count, but they don't count. Yes, they do. It doesn't just, you can't just speak louder and faster and then be like, haha, I've won the argument. You can't just blow past evidence and then be like, nope, I am correct. You can't just cherry pick from history and then say, no, this is what happened. And yet, historians do. And this is one of many problems with the academic community, and this is one of many, many problems in the witchcraft community, because the witchcraft books will just cite historians they agree with and ignore everyone else. For example, I could, while saying midwives were accused of witchcraft, cite Margaret Murray. I could say Margaret Murray supports my argument, except that Margaret Murray was a terrible historian, and her work has been proven to be full of fallacious claims, to not be accurate. So if I cited her to support my argument, that would invalidate my argument. And yet, I could, as many witchcraft books do, but I'm not going to. So I guess my rant essentially sums up as, when you are doing what I've been begging you to do through all of my other rants, doing research from peer-reviewed studies, from people who actually have a degree in history and aren't just writing a witchcraft book, from cultural anthropologists, understand that they too will have a bias. They too will have something that they are trying to prove. They will have an argument that they are invested in, and that they aren't always a reliable source. So read broadly, read widely. If someone makes an argument, see if a paper has been published with a counter argument saying why this or that is not true. And does it make my research take forever? Yes, it does. It really, really does. But at the end of the day, I feel fairly confident that the majority of what I've written down is true. Does that mean that absolutely everything is correct? No. And I also need to be prepared for research coming out that invalidates something that I've believed. You're never done. You're never done learning. And you can either let it piss you off and exhaust you, or you can let it excite you. But that's it. That's all I wanted to rant about. I'm happy to tell you the paper that I just disagreed with. And I will be posting some of the research that I did for this very exhaustive 3 to 4 month class. It would not be fair to the students who donated to attend the private class to post all of what I am teaching them. So I will only be posting a small segment of the research to YouTube, and I will put the link to the private class in the comments below if y'all want to attend it. I will probably post a brief timeline of midwives being accused of being witches and how that relates to abortion in the next few weeks. But that's literally, half of one of 17 to 18 classes from this series. So I won't feel too bad about that. All right. Thank you for joining us. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment below, and let me know what kind of content you want to see from our channel moving forward. Be safe out there, everyone.